Forgive us for our pride in order to work together efficiently. Even if we have different opinions, unite us. Help us to listen respectfully as others share their perspective. Help us to engage in meaningful discussion. Allow us to grow closer as a group and nurture the bonds of community. All these we ask to you, Lord God. Amen. In the name of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Noy. And now, we will call on APCO Chairman, Secretary Raul Albino, to give today's opening remarks. Chairman
Thank
Raul.
you. Thank you, President Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone.
This meeting is being recorded.
Let me welcome all participants to this virtual forum of the Association of Philippine-China Understanding, especially our two resource speakers who will be properly introduced later. The topic for discussion today is one of the great issues that our current generation of Filipinos must confront and comprehend, analyze and evaluate, and mindful always of its historical contours and its subtle ties. This is President Rodrigo Roa Duterte's policy of rapprochement with the Asian superpower China. This pivot away from the previous administration's policy of belligerence towards China has drawn praise as a bold stance in crisis management and a stroke of genius in diplomacy, quote unquote. But to those who are perennial critics of government, nothing good and everything bad has come out of this policy. This makes for good media headlines, but the result is that it masks the great opportunities to be had by the country, while it also obscures the great dangers that lie ahead in a conflict with a superpower. The partisan criticism of this policy of rapprochement has not deterred independent analysts from peeling off layer upon layer of political spin and propaganda to reveal the good this policy has produced for the country. One such scholarly study was done by Mark Brian Manantan. He is a research fellow at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the National Chengchi University in Taiwan. He writes, and I quote, "Recognizing the institutional mechanisms that would otherwise enforce the arbitral ruling are lacking, and that the Philippines' weak defense capabilities would do little to deter China from pressing its sovereign claims in the South China Sea. The Duterte government has instead resorted to embracing China's preference for bilateral talks. This has afforded the Philippines the chance to diversify its policy options by normalizing relations with China and consequently benefiting from bilateral economic cooperation between the two countries." End of quote. According to government statistics, the total investment of Chinese enterprises in the Philippines was 42.5 billion pesos during the period 2010 to 2015. From 2016 to 2019, such Chinese investments grew 3 times to 143.2 billion pesos. The independent foreign policy of President Duterte indeed has greatly benefited the Philippines. Another study titled, quote, "Dealing with China in the South China Sea," unquote, was published by the Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt. A senior researcher of that institute named Peter Kreuzer explains in the study why the arbitration suit is a provocation that hardened rather than softened the Asian superpowers' approach to the South China Sea disputes. Kreuzer wrote, and I quote, "This unprecedented Philippine move was seen by China as an outright challenge, to which it responded with highly assertive steps on the ground in the South China Sea," unquote. These views are not widely known to the Filipino public. One shows the benefits of our pivot to China, the other, the tough challenges that we continue to navigate arising from tensions that the arbitral ruling spawned. What lies ahead of the Philippines in the coming months? Will bilateral talks produce a solution acceptable to both countries? Our two resource persons are here to help us understand and explain the emerging picture. Let us listen to them. So, welcome to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Raul, for the opening remarks. And now I will call on APCO Vice President Felix Guanzon to introduce our first guest speaker this afternoon. Felix.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This task of introducing our guest speaker is a great honor and privilege. He is currently the president of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, a member of the board of directors of the China Southeast Asia Research Center on the South China Sea, a professor lecturer at the International Studies Department of Miriam College, an adjunct professor at the National Institute for South China Sea Studies, while serving as a member of the International Panel of Experts of the Maritime Awareness Project of the National Bureau of Asian Research. The Sacagawea Peace Foundation based in Washington, D.C. He was a fellow of the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies based in Hawaii. He is also the chairman of the Philippines Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research, while serving as the president of the Philippine Society for Intelligence and Security Studies. He finished his BA and Master in Political Science at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, where he also worked for his PhD in Political Science. He earned his PhD in International Relations at Jinan University in Guangzhou, China. He has, to his credits, numerous publications on geopolitics, counterterrorism, Philippine foreign relations, Philippine local political dynamics, regional security, and international politics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Romel C. Banlawi.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to convey my gratefulness to Aku for inviting me again to speak in your webinar. Particularly, I would like to thank President Jeffrey Nang and Chairman Lambino for the invitation. So I would like to share my slides now. Okay, sorry. Okay, can you see my slide now? Okay. Okay, can you see? Okay, good. So I'd like to describe achievements and challenges in Philippines-China relations under the Duterte presidency. So before that, I would like to explain a little bit Duterte's China-friendly policy, the achievements of this China-friendly policy, and the challenges. And when it comes to the challenges, I would like to focus my discussion on the bilateral consultative mechanism in the South China Sea, because the South China Sea is the most difficult aspect of Philippines-China relations. So regarding Duterte's China-friendly policy, there are a lot of scholars and experts describing it as a pivot to China. But
excuse me, Dr. Romel.
Yes.
Do you have your slides on already?
Yes,
we don't see your slides.
Okay, I will. Wait a minute. Okay. Can you see my slide now?
Okay, we can see your slides.
Okay, now. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Good.
As I said earlier, there are scholars and experts describing Duterte's China-friendly policy as pivot to China. But for me, it is not accurate to describe Duterte's foreign policy as pivot to China, because China is not the central point of Philippine foreign policy, where Philippine foreign relations swing around. Okay. While there's no doubt that President Duterte's foreign policy intentionally promotes friendly relations with China, Philippines-China relations is not the cornerstone of Philippine foreign policy. Based on my analysis of foreign policy practices of the Duterte administration and even his enunciation of Philippine foreign policy, it is not available to China. President Duterte maintains the promotion of three pillars, which is the main pivot of Philippine foreign policy. And these three pillars are the preservation and enhancement of national security, the promotion and attainment of national security, and protection of the rights and promotion of the welfare of overseas Filipino contract workers. For me, the more accurate term to describe Duterte's China-friendly policy is a paradigm shift to China, because it is a shift from adversarial relations to comprehensive strategic cooperation. It's like shifting gear from confrontation to cooperation. Well, it is true that the Philippines has difficult relationship with China because of the South China Sea disputes. But being friendly with China is one of the innovative and pragmatic approaches being implemented by the Duterte government to overcome all these difficult issues with China arising from the South China Sea disputes. And for me, it is in fact an attempt of the Duterte government to really implement an independent foreign policy that is mandated by the 1987 Constitution, primarily cutting the umbilical cord of dependence from the United States. And if you will in fact examine the main context of this provision in the Constitution, it has something to do with the heavy dependence on the United States in the implementation of our foreign policy. And for me, cooperation with China is just one critical portion of the diversification of Philippine foreign relations, as in fact stressed earlier by Chairman Labino in his opening remarks. If you will look at the relationship of President Duterte with other countries and his implementation of his foreign policy, economically, the Philippines has greater cooperation with Japan and South Korea. On defense and security matters, the Philippines has greater cooperation with the United States for apparent reason, and growing cooperation with South Korea, Australia, and also Japan. And right now, since 2016, the Philippines is exploring strategic cooperation with India, Russia, Israel, and recently France, Germany, United Kingdom, and many other countries. So I consider this as part of diversification strategy of Duterte's foreign policy. So what are the factual achievements of this China-friendly policy of the Duterte administration? Based on the records coming from the Embassy of China, the two countries have implemented 11 major projects, in fact completed 11 major projects, implemented 6 projects, and 18 projects for implementation. But based on my analysis of these 11 major projects, primarily pertaining to drug control, anti-terrorism, which is in fact my main focus in Philippines-China relations, agriculture and food security, radio and television services, internet services, as well as COVID-19 medical assistance and vaccine donations. I consider all these projects completed as small items project put in a heavy-duty small box. These projects are important to really promote friendly ties between the Philippines and China. But the big items projects are in fact in the Duterte's Build project that Beijing intends to support. And you know already all these big ticket projects, and I will not discuss them in detail, but these are the list of these big ticket projects. Unfortunately, there are significant delays in the implementation of these projects because of technical and legal issues, also administrative and bureaucratic politics, and also domestic political dynamics in our country. But if implemented, these big ticket projects can generate $24 million worth of investment and credit line pledges that can generate 2 million jobs for Filipinos. So it's very important to implement this. But based on the record I got from the National Economic Development Authority, that only 2 projects are being implemented under China's funding program. And that is the Binondo, Intramuros, and Estrella Pantaleon Bridges project. Okay? And details of that can be found in this report that I'm showing you on the slide. And also the Chico River Jump irrigation project. Okay? These are the 2 major projects currently being implemented by China that can make a great impact on Philippines-China relations. If you will look at the other aspects of Philippines-China economic relations, Despite the pains caused by international arbitration case, China has intentionally engaged the Duterte government to reinvigorate damaged political ties with the Philippines, starting, of course, from the importation of more than 2 million tons of tropical fruits worth $2 billion from the Philippines, particularly coming from the Davao provinces, since June 2016. And Chinese New Year is driving demand for imported fruits from Davao provinces. And this is, in fact, one of the indications of friendly gesture to promote closer Philippines-China relations. And to reinvigorate bilateral economic relations, more than 40 Chinese enterprises sub-invested in the Philippines from 2016 to 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic. And this employed close to 20,000 workers and indirectly generating 26,000 jobs opportunities for Filipinos. But my closer examinations of these 40 Chinese enterprises, they're all focused mainly on the operation of Philippine offshore gaming operations, and there are also social and political implications arising from the operations of this China investment in Pogo, which I already discussed that in my previous lectures. But the good thing about Duterte's China-friendly policy is that the Philippines became, once again, the recipient of China's official development assistance, unlike during the previous administration, where there was zero official development assistance coming from China. But the Duterte's friendly policy made the Philippines a recipient of China's ODA, particularly financing from ASEAN Infrastructure Investment Bank, and opportunities to participate in China's Belt and Road Initiative in the context of the Duterte's Build program. But so now, based on the records from the National Economic Development Authority, China is one of the major sources of our ODA. But of course, Japan is still the #1 source of Philippine ODA. So these are the records. But in 2018, China became the top foreign investor in the Philippines. Okay. And in 2019, China became one of the major sources of foreign tourists, reaching 1.7 million, only to be interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. And in 2019, China became the #1 import supplier, according to the Department of Trade and Industry. And based on its March 2021 assessment, this is coming from the Department of Trade and Industry, and I would like to acknowledge the help of the DTI for providing me this data, that China is in fact #1 top import supplier of the Philippines as of March 2021, and also the top export market of the Philippines as of March 2021. And on the left are all the commodities being traded between the Philippines and China is topping both the export and import market. And this is validated by the Philippine Statistics Authority, that the People's Republic of China was the country's bigger supplier of imported goods and major trading partner. And this is the figure indicating that China is topping the export market of the Philippines and also the import market of the Philippines, according to the data shared by the Philippine Statistics Authority. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, China was the first country that provided the Philippines medical assistance to respond to the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. And upon request of the Philippine government, Chinese government sent medical experts to the Philippines last April as part of its continuing medical assistance. In 2021, this year, China became the #1 source of COVID-19 vaccines, according to the Department of Health. And according to the latest SWS survey, majority of Filipinos prefer the use of Sinovac vaccines. So these are the facts. You know, I'm not inventing any data here. These are just based on the data produced by government authorities and also supported by reliable sources. Now, what are the achievements in the area of political relations? The Philippines and China since 2016 have been implementing what we call in the academe as party-to-party diplomacy. The Communist Party of China, which is in fact celebrating its centennial this year, 100 years of the Communist Party of China. Okay, the party promotes dialogues with the Philippine political parties in the Philippines, like the ruling PDP Laban, the Lakas CMD, the National People's Coalition, the Partido ng Masang Pilipino, and even the opposition party, the Liberal Party. And since 2016, the Communist Party of China has conducted at least 10 meetings with Philippine political parties. And last June last year, the Philippines and China established this important mechanism. It's called the China-Philippines Political Parties Belt and Road Construction Mechanism. This aims to promote and build confidence and trust in order to strengthen economic relations between the two countries in the context of the implementation of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And the theme of the last year meeting was working together to promote economic development and improve people's lives through Belt and Road cooperation. So how about in the area of security? I will focus more on this area of security because this is my cup of tea. In 2017, the Philippines and China established the bilateral consultative mechanism in the South China Sea. This is a product of President Duterte's visit to China in 2016 when he met President Xi Jinping. Detail of this BCM is found in my recent publication published in Singapore on the bilateral consultative mechanism in the South China Sea. And I encourage you to access this publication because I discuss here in detail the achievements of the bilateral consultative mechanism in the South China Sea. Last 2019, they held their fifth meeting, and I would like to emphasize the fifth meeting of the bilateral consultative mechanism because it was in this meeting when the two countries decided to create important working groups to promote cooperation between the two countries rather than confrontation in the South China Sea. Working groups on political security, fisheries, and cooperation, and the working group on marine scientific research and marine environmental protection, which I consider necessary to really promote cooperation in the South China Sea. It was also during the bilateral consultative mechanism fifth meeting when both countries discussed the details of the planned joint development of natural gas and oil in the South China Sea. And if you want detailed discussion about discussions on the joint development of natural gas and oil, I will be happy to deliver a separate lecture on that. And both parties can also pursue joint maritime law enforcement cooperation and coordinated search and rescue operation in the South China Sea, which became the topic during the virtual BCM held last May 21. It's not May 31, but May 21, where they held their 6th BM. It was during the 6th BCM when the two parties exchanged views on the current situation in the South China Sea, particularly in the aftermath of the Julian Pilipiri incident and also the series of protests filed by the Philippine government against China as a result of China's increased presence in the Kalayaan Island Group. They also discussed maritime issues between the two countries and, more importantly, they discussed their next steps to further expand exchanges and cooperation on maritime search and rescue operations, joint fishery management, ecological conservation, scientific research, and other areas like joint development and maritime law enforcement cooperation. So there are already steps being undertaken by the two countries to emphasize the need to cooperate rather than compete in the South China Sea. But there are challenges. There are challenges that the two countries need to face in order to really make their friendship fruitful and sustainable. First, on the issue of the BCM, there's no doubt that it has improved Philippines-China relations during the Duterte administration. And improved political relations spilled over to economic relations in other areas that I already discussed earlier. The BCM also contributed not only to the friendly relations of the two countries, but also to the calming of the overall regional security situation in the South China Sea, which I think I described earlier in my previous lectures that it is a calm before the storm. But the relative calm contributed to the negotiations on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea and the implementation of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. And right now, we now have a single draft negotiating text where ASEAN and China intend to conclude, eventually. Okay? And I hope they will conduct their meeting virtually this year to discuss their next steps in the COC negotiations. However, there are uncertainties if this positive momentum can be sustained in the post-Duterte period. Despite some of its achievements, the BCM has inherent limitations in really resolving maritime and territorial conflicts in the South China Sea. Number one, there are domestic oppositions. Okay, and there are also difficult national positions of other claimants and involvement of other stakeholders. Even actions of extra-regional powers can provide tremendous challenges for the BCM, particularly the actions of the United States in the South China Sea. All these factors can set the limits of what the BCM can actually achieve under the Duterte administration. Domestically, the BCM received strong public criticisms because of the perception, a public perception that China is hijacking the agenda of the BCM. For me, this is not accurate because I closely examine the BCM. But this is the fact that there are strong public criticisms. Moreover, this is the sad reality, the inconvenient truth. Only people in the government share the optimism created by the BCM. Filipinos still carry strong anti-China sentiments despite some achievements of the BCM. In a recent survey conducted by SWS, released last July 2020, China continued to suffer low trust rating from Filipinos because of China's activities in the South China Sea. Filipinos' trust deficit towards Beijing makes it difficult for the next Philippine administration to advocate a China-friendly policy, especially if the next government will not have the same popularity presently enjoyed by President Duterte. And considering that the BCM is an executive effort rather than a state commitment, sustaining it after the Duterte administration is really an enormous challenge for the two countries, unless the next government has the Duterte magic, what I call the Duterte magic, or the strong will to sustain a China-friendly approach. Since the BCM is a bilateral effort, applying its various plans of cooperation in the South China Sea is problematic, especially in the Sprat list, because of the involvement of other claimants and stakeholders. Okay. At least, well, the China and the Philippines can implement it in the Scarborough Shoal because the Scarborough Shoal is only contested between the two countries, so they can undertake a lot of bilateral cooperation in that area. But in the larger South China Sea area, the cooperative plans of the BCM can be problematic. Claimants and stakeholders conduct their own unilateral and multilateral activities in the South China Sea that can obstruct the implementation of cooperative plans of the BCM. We always pay attention to the actions of China, but I would like to also encourage you to pay attention also to the actions of Vietnam. Vietnam is also doing a lot of military and paramilitary and even economic activities in contested areas in the South China Sea, most importantly in the Sprat list. And Vietnam, in fact, in one of their statements is saying that the Spratly belongs to Vietnam. So we have to pay attention also, not only to the actions of China, but also to the actions of other claimants in the Sprat list. The involvement of extra-regional powers, particularly the United States, also sets the limits of what the BCM can achieve. Beyond the concept of freedom of navigations, the United States also has interest in fishery management, marine environmental protection, search and rescue operations, and most importantly, oil and gas development in the South China Sea. Thus, without the appreciation, if not full support of the United States, the Philippines and China will find it cumbersome to implement the cooperative plans of the BCM, particularly in the context of growing China-US major rivalry in the South China Sea. So we also look forward to see China and the United States getting along so that we will have less problems implementing our own plans to promote cooperation in the South China Sea. And finally, the BCM does not have the intention to resolve the South China Sea disputes. This needs another mechanism to do so. The main objective of the BCM is to primarily promote CBMs, confidence building measures, to facilitate bilateral cooperation that is expected to contribute to preventive diplomacy in the South China Sea. Thus, the BCM only provides initial steps in a 1,000-mile journey towards the eventual resolution of conflicts in the South China Sea. And this is the context why President Duterte is saying that it will take another generation to solve this conflict in the South China Sea. And his wisdom is not enough to provide a solution to the current conflict in the South China Sea. Like other bilateral relations, there are achievements and challenges in Philippines-China relations under the Duterte administration. But there's no perfect bilateral relations. There will always be difficulties. But we need to educate our people about the nature and dynamics of these bilateral relations, its value to advance Philippine national interests, its regional importance, its implication for international security, particularly in the context of US-China rivalry. Philippines-China relations is not only an issue of Philippine national interest. We always want to view Philippine-China relations in the context of our own national interest. But we have to take into account that Philippines-China relations has regional and international dimensions. Thus, grappling with Philippines-China relations, we need to pay attention not only to Philippine national interest, but also to regional international interests where promotion of Philippine national interest also take place. The paramount principle of Philippine foreign policy is the advancement of Philippine national interests. But Philippine foreign policy also includes the promotion of regional and international interests. And for me, this is my suggestion based on my research, we should view Philippines-China relations from the lens of our national, regional, and international interests so we can advance not only Philippine national security, but also regional and international security. I consider this as a three-level analysis of Philippine security that should inform our Philippine foreign policy. Pursuing a China-friendly policy promotes not only Philippine national security interests, but also regional and international security interests. That is why there are a lot of countries closely monitoring the current situation and future direction of Philippines-China relations. So to conclude, I would like to invite you to go back to Plato's allegory of the cave. I will not elaborate this allegory of the cave, but if there will be a chance in the open forum, I will be happy to discuss briefly the Plato's allegory of the cave. It has something to do with Confucius' statement that real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. A lot of issues pertaining to our relationship with China is caused by our ignorance about the nature and dynamics of Philippines-China relations. So we need to overcome this ignorance. And as part of our contribution in PAX, we are producing a lot of materials, we are producing knowledge materials to contribute to the enlightenment of our people on the nature of Philippines-China relations. So I invite all of you to access our website and download our free publications to inform you on the many ramifications of Philippines-China relations, Chinese studies, and Chinese in the Philippines. To conclude, even if China and the Philippines disagree on key issues in the South China Sea, the two countries can still be friendly with each other. Our country has more to gain in cooperation and a lot of things to lose in confrontation, not only with China, but with the rest of the world. With that note, thank you so much for your attention. Good afternoon to all.
Thank you, Dr. Romel. For those who have questions, just type it in the chat box. Dr. Romel will answer your questions in the open forum after our second speaker. And now, to introduce our second speaker for this afternoon, we will call on Mrs. Mafi Hung Chai, APCO Director and Chairman of the Youth Committee, to introduce our second speaker.
Thank you, President Jeffrey. Good afternoon, everyone. So our second speaker for today is a broadcast journalist, columnist, radio host, commentator, and presently, he is a professor of history, political economy, and journalism at Polytechnic University of the Philippines. Having graduated from De La Salle University and gained his degree of history, political science, and liberal arts economics, he has been a columnist of various newspapers and active in media offices for 30 years. In addition, he has been involved in politics for 23 years. So in the next few minutes, we will be learning the historical and civilizational achievements and challenges of Philippines-China relation under Duterte administration. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Herman Laurel.
Maraming salamat, Mafi, and of course, Chairman Raul. Thank you, President Jeffrey Nang. Of course, my professor from LaSalle 40 years ago, Dr. Wilfrido Villacorta. Then, of course, Pete Arce, who has been I've been associating with for several decades. Uh, who else should I acknowledge before I begin? Anyway, everybody and all the members of APCO. I was aware that the field of our first speaker would be focusing on these nitty-gritties of the current relations of the Philippines and China. So I thought I would complement it with a broader perspective of the achievements and challenges of China with President Duterte. And let me begin now. Let me just, flip the guide that I have. I will begin with a quote from Shakespeare. There is history in all men's lives. Because this is what I want to stress in what we're discussing today. We are making history. APCO is making history. Each individual involved with APCO and involved in the very, very vital activities of APCO is helping change history. And that is what is happening today. China and Duterte are engaging at a time of a most critical crossroads in human history, similar to the period in the past that determined the events, periods in the past that determined the events generations going forward. One such crossroad in the past was the 1453 Ottoman capture of Constantinople that led to the West's search for a sea route to the east and eventually to the surge in Western imperialism and colonialism. And that is what today is. It is about the final end of Western imperialism and colonialism. And President Duterte, of course, China's rise has given, opened the last doors to the final breakdown of Western imperialism and colonialism. And let us not be lulled to thinking that it has been gone for the past 50 years. No, it was going very strong under neo-colonialism. And Duterte's entry in the last Philippine elections has changed the whole configuration in the South China Sea, in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. Let's go on. So 70 years after the end of the Second World War, many former colonies attained independence, but never fully.
Herman, excuse me. Are you sharing your slides?
Yeah, but I'm not yet into the first one. The first
Okay,
one will
okay,
be
okay.
a 45
Just to be
second,
sure. Okay.
The first one will be a 45-second video, a very happy one, but it would summarize this point in history of Western imperialism and colonialism. So the arrival of China has been God sent to these former colonies and a tremendous boost to their dream of becoming truly emancipated economically, politically, and so on. It is really an echo of the dream expressed in the 1955 Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Nations, struggling at that time to rise from the era of colonialism. And one of the signals that this end of the imperial age and colonial age is here are two apologies that were recently expressed by two former colonizers. But before I go into that, let me play this video. You must have heard this before, but the message is really very important at this point in time. And I'll ask Joss, my technician, to play it. Please, 45 seconds lang ito. Are you hearing the video, audio? I'm not hearing the audio.
No, we don't hear the audio.
Yeah. Let's try it again, Josh, because the audio is the important thing. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Josh. The title of what I wrote for this discussion is, let me just go up. China Duterte secures mankind's morning sun. Not just South Africa's morning sun, but the world's morning sun. And of course, this song from South Africa talks about the problems of South Africa, and the dream of liberation of South Africa, which has to some extent been achieved by South Africa, by the blacks of South Africa, but still the vast majority of the lands in South Africa are owned by the whites. But now we go to the two apologies, one from Macron and the other from the German Finance Minister Heiko Maas. And these are the images. Josh, can you show the images? There it is now. So the Washington Post and many other news media reported recently Francis Macron admits some guilt for Rwanda's just genocide. And the BBC reports this other one. Germany officially recognizes colonial era Namibia genocide and offers a more or less 1 billion euro compensation in terms of projects for a decade coming. And so forth. Of course, these are not the only colonial era genocides. Our next images will highlight some of these. And Australia has recently apologized to Aborigines for stolen generations. The Belgian king, which is one of the worst colonizers, Belgium, expresses deepest regrets for the Democratic Republic of Congo colonial abuses. The Belgians killed, by various historical accounts, 10 million Congolese, And the next image, of course, is Mexico with a new president. Obrador demanded apology for colonial abuses of Spain, although Spain is still resisting this. And India, there are many studies now that the British Raj, British colonial government, siphoned out over the centuries $45 trillion from India. Our next image, I think, comes closer to home. In the brutality of the Philippine-American War, some of our, at least two of our historians, one of them is Eric, what's the full name of Eric San Juan? But anyway, estimates that the actual civilian casualty in the Philippine-American War was 1.4 million in a time when the Philippine population was 8 million people. And of course, China, who can forget the century of national humiliation. So these are just some of the memories of an era that has lasted for some countries in a region like the Philippines for 500 years, 400 years, plus at least half a century of American direct colonialism, and of course China around 200 years, India hundreds of years too. So now let me go on. There are more genocide histories. The Philippines, of course, I've mentioned estimates of the killings in the Philippines and the atrocities and so on. So even after the so-called independence, the former colonial powers continued exploitation and oppression of the former colonies, steered internal conflicts to keep them weak and manipulable. But now comes China, offering resources and technology for development. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, its initiation of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa Partnership, the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, partnership with ASEAN in the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and many other partnerships. China has cut the path for the emerging nations and economies towards their dream of full development and prosperity, and towards mankind's durable peace and progress. And why is it that it is China that is helping in all these, and not the Western powers who have had who have held sway for the past 500 years? There are well-known philosophical and cultural distinctions of Western and Eastern, particularly Chinese civilizations, that causes one to be exploitative and the other to be nurturing of mankind. Here is a clip of Gyude Moore, a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development and previously served as Liberia's Minister of Public Works, explaining some aspects of this from an African's point of view. And I think it's well worth it to listen very carefully because this shows how much hope Africa is investing in the entry of China. And it is, I think, important for Filipinos also who are victims of so much disinformation about China's projects in the Philippines, all over the world, and particularly Africa. So this is just a 3-minute clip of Gyude Moore's presentation entitled China in Africa, an African Perspective. So let's roll it, Josh. The audio again, please. Let's make sure it's heard.
Development and stability in Africa future, and how do you see the China's role in this?
So suspend disbelief, yeah? Just dream with me for a minute. The Belt and Road Initiative establishes the old Silk Road, and then there's a maritime, that's the belt, and then there's a maritime road. If it works, we're looking at a future in which it would take a week for goods from China to arrive at African ports. A week, at least in East Africa. Imagine that. Currently, it takes anywhere between 6 to 9 months for that to happen. Imagine that happening within a week. When I was minister, one of the projects that we worked on was this project from, if you know anything about the continent, imagine from Dakar. Yeah? Well, I don't know. But from Dakar, you come down to Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea-Conakry, Liberia, Abidjan, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria. So this is a highway. It's supposed to be a 6-lane highway that takes you from Dakar and ends in Lagos. But there's also a road that's supposed to cross the continent from Lagos to Mombasa, right? So I want you to imagine a future in which it now takes a week for goods produced as far away as China to arrive at an African port in East Africa. And within 3 days or so, that is in West Africa. That is the possibility of what could happen in terms of, and the role. So what I see, I think it's also important to understand the kind of future that Africa faces. There is supposed to be a net increase of 800 million Africans entering the workforce by 2050. The World Bank projects that only a quarter of them will be able to find jobs. Where are these people going to work? What are they going to eat? If we do not grow our economy, in a way that is able to absorb them, that's going to be a huge problem. So whatever African countries do, whatever Africa does in terms of its economic future, is going to have very heavy Chinese prints on them. China is going to be a very big part of Africa's future for the foreseeable future. And the thing is, how can we make that relationship foreseeable, equitable, and alternate?
Okay. So the video of Guy Demour summarizes centuries of history and the climax of that period today and China's role here. Of course, later on we'll discuss Duterte's role in all these and what the meaning of securing mankind's morning sun is in the fullest sense. And when I say that the APCU and its members in performing its duties of promoting understanding, promoting relations between China and the Philippines, and when I say it's very important, I really mean it. It is a very passionate task that we should be doing because this is about the dream of mankind. I will explain further. Anyway, why is China doing this? Aside from the wisdom of 5,000 years of civilization and having gone through 4,800 years ago, the violence, the wars to consolidate a nation, thousands of history that has passed, the lessons from the century of humiliation, the lessons from the 1995 Bandung Conference and the aftermath and the Cold War and so on. The Chinese and the Eastern outlook of seeking harmony between man, neighbor, and with nature has learned this lesson that win-win is better than, as Winston Churchill says, war. You know? Jojo talking, bilateral discussions and talks, and multilateral discussions are better than war. However, the West, its philosophy is founded on individualism. Let me look at some of these. Yeah, the Western political philosophies and cultures are based on individualism, zero-sum nationalism, subjugation of nature and other men, and as it stands today, profit. But there has been debates, discussions between the East and the West on this matter. The East have proposed, particularly China, the dialogue of civilizations, or China, the harmony of civilizations. Iran has been proposing the dialogue of civilizations. Yet we see from the West only slogans like America First. And this is one sample of that discussion and debate. The article from the Washington Post some time back, Trump's America First meets China's community of common destiny. These are important discussions and debates because this is about mankind's vision, your vision, my vision. I feel these visions very passionately, as I will continue to explain later on. So Eastern philosophy and culture seeks harmony in society, between men, amongst men, with nature. Tianxia is made up of two characters, heaven or sky and below. Some term it to be all under heaven, which is all that I take it to mean. And in the positive interpretation of most, it means all under heaven, mankind is one. But some Western pundits interpret it as all under a dictatorship. The global COVID-19 crisis highlights the impact of the two different outlooks. In the West, 17 months after the initial outbreaks, they are still disputing the necessity of waiving vaccine patent rights to allow poorer countries to produce the vaccines, while China has donated vaccines to over 50 countries and exported to dozens more at global public good cost. The Western approach to the COVID-19 crisis is ultimately self-defeating, similar to their approach to global economics and governance, as WHO warns that unsuppressed virus mutation in poor or low-income countries where vaccine access is limited or almost non-existent can lead to the super mutants that will return and break herd immunity. The exploitative Western geopolitical model beggaring its neighbors in a zero-sum game leads to eventual destruction of mankind, while the Eastern approach represented today in China's outreach project seeks what it calls and what we see as win-win results. China is working with nations all over the world to start in-country production of vaccines in several nations. China's COVID-19 response, explicated by President Xi as early as April of 2020, speaks volume about the difference in the perspective of the East and the West. And I mentioned the timing of President Xi's announcement because it is important to show that China really processed it very early and came to the conclusion that the only good and right thing to do for mankind was to try to distribute as much vaccine as possible to the poorest nations of the world at the lowest cost possible. But the West has only paid lip well, anyway, this is, I almost missed this. There are, of course, well-wishers in the West who share the dream of global peace and development for mankind. I'm brought up in the Western culture with our educational system in the past. When I asked myself, where did I learn the value of global peace, if not from a Christmas carol I was as a child enamored with that sang, "Peace on earth, goodwill to all men." You know that Christmas carol, of course. But the West has only paid lip service to global peace and communitarianism. China has not only espoused, but has taken concrete steps towards that, quote, community of shared future for mankind, unquote, with ASEAN and Asia helping build that global community. Okay, and okay. Meanwhile, the U.S. has continued the past 2 decades its imperial policy of pivot to Asia, particularly the last decade. I will not elaborate on this, maybe in some future discussions, to show that the pivot to Asia was already brewing in the strategic planners of the United States in the first decade of the 21st century, particularly 2005. And they were already planning on the control of the Malacca Straits and the containment and final closure of China. And that is why China had to move very fast in 2011 and 2012. That led to the reactions of the US allies of raising certain landmines along the way of China. For example, the nationalization of the Senkaku, which when it was privately owned was not an issue to China, but when you nationalize it, it becomes a government issue, government-to-government issue. And likewise, the Scarborough, which had been peaceful for millennia and common fishing grounds for all, became an issue created by the Noynoy administration, Noynoy Aquino administration. Anyway, that's an entirely separate discussion with a lot of details. I'm just checking the time to make sure I limit myself to 25 minutes, which is almost up. So the U.S. platform for Asia and ASEAN is the Quad project, an attempt to organize a military alliance to supersede other Asian regional partnerships. But of course, it is particularly to contain China. Mahathir has warned about the Quad project as a dangerous project and reminds him of the Second World War. Here's a report from Nikkei Asia. Old Quad strategy. Old. It's an old strategy. It was the strategy they used against Japan that led to the Second World War. This is what Mahathir said. This risk provoking China, Malaysia's Mahathir said. And I will read, the Quad is an old strategy of encirclement, where you try to encircle the enemy. But when you do that, the enemy will retaliate. Just before we started formally this discussion, when we were with General Vic Corpus, Jeffrey, and a dozen others in the waiting room, in the Zoom room, General Vic Corpus raised the issue of the Americans' plan to deploy intermediate missiles in the first island chain. So these are very crucial issues, but it's a subject for future discussion. Mahathir is giving the warning. I think we all know that there is danger to this Quad plan. The Quad plan has problems with India, with Japan, but again, that's for another discussion. And Voice of America reports on the warships that the American allies are sending. Western countries send ships to South China Sea in pushback against Beijing. Actually, I just chastised a young academic Filipino scholar, now I think a fellow in some of the Western think tanks, who was excited with an article he posted in Facebook, and very excited, saying, so we can have new alliances. Not realizing, I said, you're not realizing you're bringing back the colonial powers. But again, there is more to say that we cannot cover this afternoon about that. Okay, and so let's now move on to the Philippines. President Duterte has shown that he is a man of history. He tells of his Muslim, Chinese, and Indo-Malay lines or lineages. Duterte feels history very strongly. He aches and pains in his soul in the suffering of his ancestors under colonialism, and showed with such passion and vehemence early in his administration. And on September 12, 2016, he presented to the world photos of the American massacre of Filipinos at Butch Daho, if you recall that. And that is really very significant. President Duterte did a Herculean job in lifting the burden of Philippine colonial history, which is being forgotten by many quarters here. Lifting it, the colonial history, burden of colonial history, as a forgotten narrative, and raising it to the center stage onto a high pedestal to focus the immensity of colonial oppression and injustice by the West, especially the Americans, upon this nation. Now, if you remember this, then all these controversies about the West Philippine Sea and so on become so minuscule, because this historical stage is about ending, finally, this Western imperialism and colonial era, and bringing the entire human race to a new stage of communitarianism, global communitarianism. And Duterte's equidistancing of the US, China, Russia restored the balance that saves Asia from the worst possible scenarios of the US-Asia pivot. Duterte's equidistancing also allows the Philippines to ride the wave of the Asian century, which is actually the Chinese century and its future. The details of those of that wave, Professor Banlawi already gave a while ago. Equidistancing is the logic behind this, quote, separation from the US, unquote, leading to the directive to abrogate the VFA, which is in suspended animation right now. For these and many other reasons, Duterte establishes himself not just as a Philippine hero, but also a global and historical hero for peace and development. While the US and its shameless minions in the Philippines, and I tell you they are shameless, the Carpios are shameless, the Del Rosarios are shameless, the Bantong Bacals are shameless, the Hildarians are shameless, the media people, Marites Bitog, who's that other lady? Anyway, we will not focus on them, but they are shameless. They are not looking at history and the future. For the last decades of minions that slander Duterte's China cooperation and blame it for all sorts of imaginary crimes, such as the death trap, which actually was committed by the US and its allies against the Philippines in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. I quote two economists, Rene Ofreneo and Walden Bello, who gave details of what happened. And Walden Bello says, for example, that debt trap that the US sprung on the Philippines and other developing nations in the 80s. In the Philippines, it would cost up to 20 to 25% of the annual government budget. And now they accuse China and Duterte of engaging in debt trap diplomacy and so on. Anyway, so I think my time is almost up, so I will shorten the discussion. But actually, so President Duterte has done a yeoman's job on all these things, and that is his role in achieving in the achievements of China and the Philippines in world history. I have some details here of the 25 billion commitment of President Xi to the Philippines, and the fact that contrary to the opposition and the critics' claim that there has been no delivery, the delivery has exceeded the $25 billion, which, if you count, and you should count since that is the agreement, public and private projects between China and the Philippines, it already exceeds the $25 billion, although some have been delayed primarily by, as mentioned by Manlawi, the legal and other aspects. There's the political aspects. For example, the Kaliwa Dam has been delayed by incessant obstructionism of some members of the Catholic Church, and of course the leftist groups or fronts of the NPA who use the mountains of Sierra Madre, where Kaliwa Dam is, as their lairs and their dens. Okay, but actually the Philippines, I will disagree a little with some of the findings of our friend Banlawi on the image of China. Actually, a straightforward survey would show that the image has really dramatically improved because economic harvests are bountiful between China and Philippines. Mentioned already by Professor Banlawi, exports to China have been growing, tourism arrivals grew phenomenally too, and so on. Anyway, let's go on to the surveys. The NATO-inspired 2021 Alliance of Democracy survey of 52,000 people in 50 countries found that in the Philippines, Filipinos see the US to be the greater threat to Philippine democracy than China. Globally, 44% see the US as the threat and only 39% see it as China. And so there's the graph that I made, but you can visit that by just searching for the 2021 Alliance of Democracy survey. You will find startling findings there. And in an online survey conducted by Net25 and Radio Avila, during an interview of Congressman Rodante Marcoleta with APCO's very own Peter Q. Lavinia, on the question, quote, do you agree to strengthen friendship rather than conflict with China, unquote, 100% agree. So it's how you frame the questions in these surveys. SWS and Pulse Asia are notoriously anti-China. We can give very clear reasons why they are so, but that's not the subject for today. The challenges to Philippine-China relations and the strategic partnerships. I will try to attenuate this discussion. One major challenge to the smooth completion of the global community of shared future project is the global information or disinformation war being waged and intensified by the US on the world and against China and Asia, which recently has been augmented with a $400 million increase in the Pentagon, in the budget, in the congressional budget for media and cyber war in the Indo-Pacific from the recent US Strategic Competition Act, which is directed against China. APCO has a very significant role in the information environment by providing accurate, objective, and positive information about Philippine-China relations and promoting all-around harmony in the country-to-country and people-to-people relations. Another challenge for the Philippines and China is to raise public concern over the increasing provocations by the US and its allies in the South China Sea. The US is deliberately creating tinderbox situations that could eventually be used as, quote, false flag moments to trigger physical conflict as the U.S. may need. The Philippines can make significant contribution in this by opposing the false justification for external interference in the region. There is absolutely no reason for warships to be going around the South China Sea. As China has repeatedly said, when has anybody blocked the South China Sea? And if there is anybody that is interested in avoiding that, it is China, because 80% of its trade passes through the Malacca Straits and the China Sea, South China Sea. The Philippines, ASEAN, and China have set the right course towards the sealing of the Code of Conduct at the earliest possible date. The consolidation of the RCEP while awaiting the COVID-19 crisis to subside, and the acceleration of the restoration of economic recovery and normalcy. The future for Philippine-China relations continues to warm in the morning sun. Thank you very much. And we're ready for your questions and discussions.
Okay. Thank you, Herman.
Yes,
And now we'll go to the open forum. Despite the concrete achievements during the past 5 years under the Duterte administration, surveys show that the majority of Filipinos still have a negative attitude towards China, as Dr. Romel Banlawi has pointed out. Is this merely a PR problem on the part of China? What else can China do to enhance the perception of Filipinos towards China? Dr. Romel Banlawi, perhaps you can answer first.
Thank you. If you will look at the rating of the survey, the gap between trust to the United States and trust to China is very narrow. In fact, if you will measure the difference, only around 45% of Filipinos distrust China. The rest neutral, okay, and 30% trust China. So if we could convince those other people who are divided, who are confused about what to say, then we can change their perception about China. But survey is really about perception. So that's why I put in my slide earlier the allegory of the cave, because this is the allegory of the cave. Many people rely on their perception. They look at the allegory of the cave, talks about people inside the cave, believing that what they see as real are those shadows being provided by people at the back of the fire. But suddenly, one man was able to go out of the cave and saw the reality out there. So when he went back to the cave and tried to enlighten people, that enlightened person was killed by those people of the cave, because they want to embrace their perception that the reality is the shadow that they see. And that's what's happening, in the way we perceive about China. There are a lot of shadows, and we have to see the reality out there. And the reality out there is that this anti-China attitude, okay, which is being articulated not only in the Philippines but also in the wider South China Sea, in the wider Asian region, is in fact a product of major power rivalry. It's really a PR issue. So, but for those who have gone to China, for example, me, I was educated initially in Europe and initially in the United States. So I went to China with a lot of Western and European perspectives. But my 8 years of study in China changed a lot of things, because I was able to interact with people in China, so a lot of places in China. And China is not that bad country anyway. That there are so many beautiful things about China, and that changed my perception about China. Now, how can we convince others about their perception to have more positive view about China? In my study of negative perception about China, first, it is carried out by our historical experience, during the time of the Spanish colonial period. We got that, that negative perception because our colonial masters, China, our colonial masters, United States, Japan, and Spain, they have this negative perception of China, and we carry those negative perceptions. So we have to overcome that historical baggages. Now, how about contemporary image of China? Our contemporary image of China has something, contemporary negative image of China has something to do with China's actions in the South China Sea. That is why I'm always telling them that you have to improve your actions in the South China Sea, because it is where the negative perception of the Filipino people is coming. But if you look at the other areas of their relationship, there are a lot of good things happening in their relationship. But in that particular aspect, the South China Sea disputes, it takes a lot of efforts also for China to make their actions not threatening to the Filipino people. Like, for example, in the Scarborough Shoal. At the policy level, now I'm answering the question of George from International Crisis Group, because he questioned about fishery activities in the Scarborough Shoal. At the policy level, there is an understanding between President Xi Jinping and President Duterte for Filipinos to resume fishing in the South China Sea. And indeed, Filipinos are allowed to fish in the South China Sea, but around the lagoon of the Scarborough Shoal, but they are not allowed to go inside the lagoon. Now, how can we improve that situation? Because the great catch is in the lagoon and not outside of the lagoon. That is why fishermen are complaining that 70% of their catch were lost because of China's control of the Scarborough Shoal. That is where the value of joint fishery cooperation is needed. Now I'm answering the question from Xinhua News about the BCM fishery cooperation. We need to really implement some steps in that area to allow both Filipinos and China to fish in the Scarborough Shoal, because the 2016 International Arbitral Tribunal declared that the Scarborough Shoal is a traditional fishing ground of both the Chinese and Filipinos. So we need to work closely on that aspect. But based on my study of fishery law in the Philippines and fishery law in China, and law enforcement operation in the Philippines and law enforcement operations in China, on the aspect of fishery management, we need to harmonize our domestic laws. So we need to exchange views on our domestic legal regimes when it comes to fishery management, because there are some fish that are allowed to catch in China, but not allowed to catch in the Philippines. So we need to harmonize our domestic laws and make our domestic laws also consistent with existing international law, particularly in the aspect of overfishing. So one step to pursue cooperation is to really sustain this talk about joint fishery management in the South China Sea, particularly in the Scarborough Shoal. So we have to make this joint fishery cooperation management work in the Scarborough Shoal to encourage others in the Greater Spratly to work on a regional fishery cooperation management mechanism in the area. And if Filipino fishermen will be happy and will not be threatened by Chinese presence in the area, then that will change the perception of the Filipinos, because they feel that they're being robbed of their resources in the South China Sea, and we need to eradicate that kind of perception that the Scarborough Shoal is very important not only for the Filipinos but also very important for the Chinese, very important for the Vietnamese, very important for other user states in the South China Sea. So we have to take that into account. So we shall not view the situation from our point of view only, but from the point of view of the region also. So this negative perception is really coming from China's actions in the South China Sea, and China can act more positively if China will really push through with its planned cooperation project with the Philippines to pursue joint fishery management, and not only joint fishery management, but also joint law enforcement operations. You know, the Coast Guard to Coast Guard relationship happening between China and the Philippines must be sustained, so that when Chinese Coast Guard see Philippine Coast Guard, they will not be threatened by each other. Okay, they will welcome each other because they know that they are protecting their traditional fishing area. Now, this partly is more complicated because it will involve other claimants, but initially, China and the Philippines can work together in the Scarborough Shoal. And we hope that their cooperation in the Scarborough Shoal can yield positive perception after that.
Okay. Thank you, Ramel. Comment, Tom? Maybe you'd like to give your opinion. You're on mute.
Okay, now you can hear me.
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you.
Yeah, first about the image. The surveys being quoted by almost all the newspapers are surveys made by only two major survey groups. That is SWS and Pulse Asia, and both are biased when it comes to the China question, and the bias can easily be directed or channeled, by the framing of the questions. Maybe this is one area where APCO can help conduct a survey, maybe in cooperation with the Federation of Filipino-Chinese Chamber of Commerce and other institutions. But we need a real independent survey. Number two, the image is also due to the mainstream media saturating media with anti-China information, news, and often fake news. I heard this international crisis group is present in the audience. Let me just read an item about the international crisis group. The plan, and this is just a short quote from this report. The plan is to raise $50 million with more than $18 million invested at the start, thanks to commitments by George Soros. Do you know George Soros? All these many other sources are biased sources directed by American propaganda and funding and so on. So that's the first point. On the issue of the what else? While I was listening about the Scarborough shoals, I also, because I reported this in my broadcast radio, TV, and so on, just April 23, this year, fishers seek shelter in occupied Panatag Shoal. Nobody's preventing Filipino fishermen there. So I don't know where all these reports about Filipino fishermen are being prevented from fishing there. Thirdly, talking about fish conservation, it is China that has an annual fisheries moratorium, fishing moratorium that starts from August. That starts from May 1 to sometime in August, maybe mid-August. So annual fishing moratorium to preserve the fertility of the South China Sea. I don't think any other country is doing that. Of course, China is the biggest fishing nation in the South China Sea. But it is good for China to be doing that, and I don't think they are imposing the same moratorium on the other fishing nations. So there's a lot of deliberate creation of misunderstanding about China and the China Sea issue. The Chinese behavior in the China Sea is perfectly correct, appropriate. It is Vietnam that should be questioned, but the Philippine media will not raise this issue. Vietnam just officially announced a warning to the Philippines when General Sobihana announced that it will be rebuilding its facilities in Panatag, if I'm not mistaken. It's in the news reports. I can look for it, but this is not the time to go into details. This is all about information war. That is why I focused on that. And it is foolish to focus on the South China Sea issue. There is no issue there between China and the Philippines. During the Gloria Macapagal administration, in the late stages, there was that three-party marine seismic survey project between amongst China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, and that was successful. It's just the American boys in the Senate, Dillon, and so on, who started raising hell about it, forcing President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo to scuttle it, and later on by Noynoy Aquino. So again, I would state my position. There is no problem with China on the South China Sea. There is no problem with China and even with Vietnam, so long as talks go on. And like the Philippine-China joint venture in the mischief-free Recto Bank, everything will lead towards that, joint ventures, cooperation, and so on. So that's my addition to that point, that question.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question here from George Parsadon. Many well-educated people in business and social circles have negative feelings towards China and mount what the Western media projects because of the South China Sea issue, which has been aggravated by China's unilateral actions. And if China doesn't stand down, it gives credence to what Western media claim. Recently, a few weeks ago, you have a big issue with the Chinese shipping boats in the Whitsun Reef. And also, we had some undiplomatic remarks by no less than the Foreign Affairs Secretary, and also protests by the Defense Secretary. Would you like to comment on this, Romel?
Well, really, China's actions in the South China Sea are really threatening very close to our sensitivity. That's why our government is also reacting to that sensitivity, because inactions on the part of the Philippine government can be interpreted as surrendering our sovereign rights and sovereignty in the spot list. But what we need to tell our people is that issues are in fact being addressed bilaterally by the Philippines and China through bilateral consultative mechanism. There are a lot of differences, and we want to settle our differences. And that is why we held our 6th BCM last May 21 to discuss these issues. And there are also issues that complicating the situation because of the interest of other countries, especially the extra-regional powers. So that is really creating a negative vibes on the issue. But if you will look at the efforts of the two countries, the Philippines and China, they are really trying to settle their differences on the issue. And multilaterally, they're also trying to settle that issue through the ongoing negotiation on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. And I would like to share the gains of the 6th BCM conducted last month. Now they want to push through with all these working groups, okay? And I hope to see more tangible results when it comes to the work of the working group on joint fishery management and marine scientific research and marine environmental protection, because that will really create a example to other claimants in the sprat list that cooperation can yield positive benefits for all parties concerned. So we just need to push through with that activities, cooperative activities. It's very deep. Well, that's being discussed by the two parties. We need to improve the situation on the ground. And how to improve the situation on the ground? First, we need to remove the fear of Chinese fishermen about the presence of China Coast Guard around the Scarborough Shoal. So China Coast Guard must be informed also that when they see Chinese Filipino fishermen in the area, they should not be subjected to what the media would call the harassment. So that's one. Second, when China also needs to exert more efforts to lessen their military and paramilitary activities in the area, because that is really causing not only fear domestically in the Philippines, but also causing regional tensions. For example, the parking of more than 300 Chinese vessels in the Julian Pilipi Reef. Well, it's too many to ignore. So China also needs to exert efforts to really lessen their activities. But in my closer examination on why the Chinese vessels are there, well, this is my first time to tell this in public, but this is the result of my exchange with Chinese scholars also. They're also trying to balance the growing presence of Vietnam in the area, because Vietnam is also deploying a lot of vessels in the area, and China is also afraid that in the future Vietnam will take over the spot list. So that's the context of China's presence. But I told them, you have to make that known to us. Information must be shared to the Philippines because it's threatening us. But if that's the case, then we need to talk to Vietnam also, because if you will see also the satellite images coming from China, I saw some satellite images coming from China. There are really increasing presence also of Vietnamese in the spot list, and they are going closer to the Red Bank. Okay, and if we complain about China's fishing activities in the spot list, there is also a growing Vietnamese fishing activities in the spot list, and they're also reaching the Scarborough Shoal. We need to know that, that should be discussed, and therefore we also have to make that known in public, that that's the fear of China, that Vietnam will take over the area. Okay, but China's presence is causing fear in the Philippines. So then we go back to the China-ASEAN negotiation on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. So what do we need to uphold in order to prevent this misperception to happen? We need to be reminded of the decision of all parties concerned to exercise self-restraint that can cause unnecessary fear in the region. So the Philippines is exercising self-restraint. We are exercising self-restraint, but China should also exercise self-restraint. Vietnam shall also exercise self-restraint, because if other parties are not exercising self-restraint, then it will force other parties to act unilaterally. And that's what's happening right now. We are acting unilaterally. We are increasing our patrols. And this is my fear. If we increase our patrol activities in the area, which is very important, then it also increases the risk of accidents. It will also raise the risk of miscalculation, and it also raise the risk of misencounter. And those are the things that we should prevent, and that can be prevented through continuous conversation, through continuous dialogues. And that is why, for me, very important that we need to maintain this bilateral consultative mechanism in the South China Sea. Now, there's a question about why it's only bilateral, not make it multilateral. It is a bilateral because there are issues in the South China Sea that are bilateral in nature and that can easily be managed by talking bilaterally. When issues become multilateral, then that will become the subject of discussions in the ongoing negotiations on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, which will take time to really conclude. But meanwhile, while we're having difficult time concluding the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, we want to do something more concrete by doing bilateral cooperation. And bilateral cooperation can happen more concretely in the Scarborough Shoal, because the Scarborough Shoal is only contested between the Philippines and China.
Thank you, Romel. Can we hear from you, Herman? You're still on mute.
Okay, concerning the Whitsun Reef incident or event in March, the end of March, at the same period, if you go to the website of the South China Sea Probing Initiative, which also monitors it, contrary to the as a counterpart to the monitoring of the ANTI and the new CIA front Simularity, which is composed, the directors are composed of former CIA people, which is the source of the Whitsun latest satellite photos about Whitsun Reef and so on. The SCSPI Probing Initiative monitored around 8,000 Vietnamese fishing boats in the same area. Why is it not reported in the Philippines? Because it's simple. It's part of the information war of the Americans and using our media and our elements of our military. These are the facts. And number two, the attorney Roque, Harry Roque, who is the international lawyer and not Locsin, has said that Whitsun Reef is not part even of the Philippine EEZ. Number three, I'm from a fishing family. We know fishing boats. One look at those fishing boats, they are fishing boats. Now, the Sobehana and the Task Force West Philippine Sea of the Philippine military claims it's manned by militia. How did they know it's manned by militia? That's all propaganda. No? There is absolutely no evidence produced for all these reports and these statements from the West Philippine Task Force and from Sobehana. Number three or number four, so-called patrols of the Chinese Coast Guard, including missile boats of the Chinese in that Sembrano report, which was proven by Lorenzana himself, our defense secretary, to be a fraud. Zambrano of ABS-CBN created the report. It was flashed on all the media, highlighted by, of course, Rappler, etc. But it was a complete hoax. So I just want people to be aware that we are being victimized by a huge, past 10 years already, media operation. And that's why I mentioned in my discussion a while ago that the Americans have been increasing their budget for this in the new Strategic Competition Act. These are the realities. So Whitsun Reef, and what are the other issues? Julian Felipe, well, I already said Whitsun Reef, William Felipe is the same thing, and I think it's important also to state again, because I've written about this, we've broadcasted this, in the group of reefs and features in Whitsun Reef. There are already, for the past decade, at least 3 Vietnamese installations and 2 Chinese installations. So these are not new. Their presence in Whitsun Reef is not new. It is just new to the Philippine public because it is reported by Philippine media and Western media, and that's all. Every month you can see, you go to the SCF's South China Sea Probing Initiative, you will see Vietnam again in April, May, with thousands of fishing boats there. But that's not being made an issue of. So again, I just conclude this part by saying, be aware that there is an information war being waged against us and China.
Okay. Thank you, Herman. Next year, we will be having the presidential elections in May, around a year from now. Foreign policy has never been a big issue in Philippine elections. But next year, do you think the China issue, the President Duterte's paradigm shift to China, is it going to be a major campaign issue among the presidential contenders for next year? Romel?
I think it will be a major campaign issue based on our experience with the last election of 2016. President Duterte became so popular after he made a pronouncement about riding on a jet ski in the South China Sea and putting a Philippine flag there. So that was the tipping point of the rise of his popularity right after the presidential debate. And right now, based on the survey, the majority of the Filipinos want stronger Philippine actions on the South China Sea. So they want to see our leaders taking a strong stand on the West Philippine Sea issue. But of course, our role as a scholar is we need to also educate our public about the nature of conflict in the South China Sea. That, you know, that the South China Sea is really an area of conflict. Okay, an area of conflict, and in fact, a flashpoint of conflict. Any unilateral action on the South China Sea will be counterproductive, not only for the national interests of parties concerned, but also for regional and international security interests. So we have to view South China Sea not only from our own perspective as a sovereign state, but also from the perspective of regional security and international security. So surely it will be a major foreign policy issue in the 2022 presidential elections, and many potential candidates, two of the potential presidential candidates have already reached me out about the South China Sea issue and about U.S.-China rivalry and about ASEAN. So I'm providing them inputs, okay, and telling them that indeed it will really matter in the election. And any candidate with strong position on the South China Sea will have a great chance of getting or winning the hearts and minds of the Filipino voters, particularly, the young people who just registered. If you look at the sentiments of the young people, they're exposed with social media information. Even my son, who is a student of Ateneo, I'm still balancing his view because he is relying his information on social media sources. So I need to make a more nuanced perspective to educate him and enlighten him, and that's our role. We need to enlighten our people. So first, if it becomes the issue of presidential election in May 2022, make the issue of the South China Sea more constructive rather than destructive. That we have to promote greater cooperation rather than waging war. Waging war is already obsolete. After the Second World War, we have learned a lot of lessons that that the war is really destructive. It's an old way already, and people around the world wants a more peaceful solutions to many of our problems. So waging a war is not a good way. So anybody who will promote that kind of platform in the May 2022 elections should be corrected. But the way ahead in the South China Sea is a more peaceful solutions, and a more peaceful solutions can be done through cooperation, and that's the spirit of the China-ASEAN negotiation on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. And that's also the main principle of the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this is the principle that is less discussed in public. And this principle advanced by UNCLOS is the principle of all parties concerned, particularly those signatories, about to pursue the duty to cooperate. Cooperation is a duty among sovereign nations, and we have to implement that as we negotiate with China on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, or in the context of the bilateral consultative mechanism in the South China Sea, that the duty to cooperate is in fact mandated by existing international law, and that duty to cooperate should be the subject of discussion in the May 2022 elections when it comes to the South China Sea dispute. Now, why do we need to increase our defense capability in the South China Sea? We need our defense capability because we need to protect our coastlines with all the non-traditional threats happening in the South China Sea, and that will be the subject of another discussion. So surely it will become an election, a major foreign policy issue in the May 2022 election.
Thank you, Romel. Herman, can we hear from you?
I have to go be reminded to unmute. Okay, is the China issue going to be relevant in the 2022 elections? Was it relevant in the 2016 elections? What did Duterte say? He made it a joke that he would jet ski to the Spratlys and so on. But he won. It's not an issue. The issue will still be, the gut issues will be economic recovery, and it is Duterte's work with China that is providing the hopes for that economic recovery. Let us not overplay this China issue for the Filipino people. And I think the 2016 election showed that. And it made fools of these opposition people who make an issue of the jet ski to Spratlys of President Duterte. I think that really is the best and shortest answer to that. And of course, as usual, personalities will be the key factors, as well as, of course, secondly, the resources in the elections. And thirdly, smartmatic. We don't know if President Duterte has control over it, and or it's still Lord Mark Malloch Brown, the British what do you call it, enforcer of George Soros. So that's, I think, what I have to say about the elections in 2022.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions from the chat room. From Aquino D. What is the stand of the Philippines regarding the loss of Puget Island to Vietnam? Why don't we see any protest from our government or the public? Also, similarly from Anna Uy, how about Vietnam's presence in the South China Sea spread across? What do you think the government should do about this? Romel?
Well, that is the inconvenient truth about international politics in the South China Sea. We always pay attention to the big elephant in the room, and the big elephant in the room is China. Now, regarding our loss of Puget Island, it's an issue between the Philippines and Vietnam, but we somehow settled that issue when Philippines and Vietnam signed this strategic partnership arrangement. And prior to the pandemic, Philippines and Vietnam conducted several confidence building measures in the Puget Island to build greater trust between Philippines and Vietnam because of their mutual understanding that the two countries should have a better understanding in order to deal with their bigger problem, and that is China. Remember, Vietnam is always a factor in our foreign relations. When we entered into a bilateral arrangement with China on the Joint Marine Seismic Undertaking in 2004, it was originally a bilateral arrangement between the Philippines and China. But Vietnam protested. And because we did not want to affect ASEAN solidarity, so we accommodated Vietnam to be part of the JMSU. So it became the tripartite agreement. Remember, Philippines and Vietnam, we have settled our differences over the years, and Vietnam understood us, especially when we treated very nicely the Vietnamese refugees during the Vietnam War. And we have better mechanism to understand each other in the context of our bilateral relations with Vietnam. So we need to develop that kind of understanding with China, so that China's actions will not be treated, will not be viewed negatively in the Philippines. But that should be known publicly, that in the 70s, we used to occupy Pogad Island, but Vietnam, to use a harsh word, robbed it from us. We raised issue, but over the years, we have overcome that issue, and we have decided to cooperate rather than confront each other in the South China Sea. And we look forward to a situation where the Philippines and China will also have the same kind of understanding, that they will cooperate rather than confront each other in the South China Sea. But always don't forget that Vietnam will be a factor in our bilateral relationship.
Thank you, Romel. Herman, can you unmute yourself first? Herman, you're on.
Yeah, okay. Can you imagine without China what the South China Sea situation between Vietnam and the Philippines would be right now? We might have had a clash already with Vietnam. The only reason why these smaller disputes have not grown bigger is because China has been made an issue by some parties. In July 1st, 2020, I published an article entitled "Vietnam, the Prowling Wolf in the Spratlys." Vietnam, of course, is the bigger menace to the other claimants in the South China Sea, especially Spratlys, with 21 islands and features that they have controlled. While China only, I think, has 8 right now, and the Philippines has 9. The 10th was supposed to be the Phuket Island. So Vietnam is an issue, and would be a bigger issue if China were not present in the configuration. But of course, China, I would like to say, is the solution and not the problem in the South China Sea. China is the one who brought everybody closer to the idea of the code of conduct, and eventually China will be the law side of the joint ventures and cooperation, the partnerships in resource development and exploitation. China will also be the source of technology for a future energy source, the flammable ice, the methane hydrates that is found in the South China Sea and in the Benham rice areas. China is the solution, not the problem.
Thank you, Herman. One last question. It's almost 5 o'clock. We'll address it first to Romel. APCU, of course, has been the pioneer for people-to-people relations between the Philippines and China. What do you think what else can APCU do to further people-to-people relations between the Chinese and the Filipino people? Do you have any recommendations for our officers and members of APCU? Romel?
Well, we need to contribute in enlightening our people through a more people-to-people contacts. We need more exchanges between the Chinese people and the Filipino people. So APCU can maybe sponsor a visit of Filipino young professionals or students to China, for them to see the great transformation of China that I witnessed over the past 2 decades, 20 years. I witnessed how China, transformed itself from backward economy to modern economy, to really well-developed economy. Although China considers itself as a developing country, I consider China as the most developing country in the world right now. So that they will have this negative, they will overcome this negative image of China. And also facilitate discussions with Chinese experts for Filipinos to understand better the Chinese perceptions of various issues confronting our bilateral relations, particularly the South China Sea. Many of our discussions are only limited to experts, but we need to broaden the audience of our discussions. For example, the Philippine Association for China Studies, our discussions are limited only with established and rising scholars, but we need to reach out with greater audience. And APCU should contribute in broadening this audience so that more and more Filipinos will learn more about China and will learn more about the nature of our bilateral relations, and also learn more about the complexities of the South China Sea disputes. In fact, my recommendation is to start discussing this issue with the elementary students in our history book. When we talk about the South China Sea dispute, we need to tell them the nuances and the many ramifications of the South China Sea disputes, of Philippines-China relations, and our national interests associated with these two major issues. So we need to do that. In China, the reason why they have this strong view about the South China Sea, because they started educating their people from an early age. But that has to be nuanced, because if there is popular nationalism in China and growing popular nationalism in the Philippines, that will also raise the risk of violent confrontation. So APCU can also reach out with scholars in China for the Chinese people also to understand our own perspective. And I'm very happy that there are some institutions in China establishing their Philippine Studies program. And this is my observation, we always hear from the speeches of many officials about our centuries-old friendship with China, that it dates back centuries ago. But in my understanding, China does not know a lot about the Philippines. They only know about the Philippines in the context of two major issues, in the context of our relationship with the United States and in the context of our membership in the ASEAN. So they need to understand us deeper by having more Philippine studies in China, and APCU can contribute towards that, to encourage scholars in China to focus more on Philippine studies, to develop Chinese scholars really focusing on Philippine studies. Because many of the Chinese scholars doing Philippine studies, their expertise is either on ASEAN or on the United States. So APCU can encourage scholars to really develop Chinese experts focus on the study of the Philippines, not only in the area of culture, language, but also in other aspects like politics, economics, okay, and other areas that can help promote better relationship between our two countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Romel. Herman?
Okay. Yeah, I mentioned already some suggestions a while ago. I think APCU, of course, I said has very, very vital role in the Philippine-China relations and, in fact, the future of humanity, of mankind. But concretely, I think the suggestion I brought up earlier, maybe APCU can lead a consortium of Filipino, Chinese, and Filipino institutions to hire an international survey group or pollster to do an really objective survey, framing the right questions to see the real sentiment of the people and what else has to be done to improve it. I think it's not only us that recognizes this. Yesterday, the news came out in Reuters, in Xinhua, and so on, that China is calling for greater global media reach by China. So they recognize also this information campaign that they need to wage. I've, of course, been doing this for the past at least two decades, trying to explain the issues concretely objectively, in a balanced way, accurately, and so on. That is the only problem. There is no problem in the relations. There is no problem in the behavior and conduct of China. They have the highest level of diplomacy and discipline in their conduct in South China Sea. It is the Philippines who has killed a Chinese fisherman, a Taiwanese fisherman. I don't know of any Chinese having recklessly committed any acts against Filipino fishermen. But these are not going to be known to the public and to the world if we don't make an effort to bring the real news, factual news to them. And I think I will just limit it to that suggestion. Do a survey. Would engage or contract an international pollster, not a Philippine pollster. So it will not be accused of being biased. But I tell you definitely, and I can prove it, Pulse Asia, when it comes to certain issues, SWS, what some people call survey na walang saysay, are really anti-China. And of course, they get paid for it. So that's what I have to say on that point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Romel, Herman, for enlightening our APCO officers, members, and friends this afternoon on the achievements and challenges of the Philippines-China relationship under President Duterte. As Dr. Romel has mentioned, Philippine foreign policy wasn't really a pivot to China under President Duterte, but it was a paradigm shift from confrontation to friendship. But despite that, South China Sea is a difficult issue. It is an emotional issue for many Filipinos, even though there have been concrete achievements in the past 5 years under this administration. We can all agree, Filipinos and Chinese, to disagree over the West Philippine Sea without being disagreeable or ever going into conflict with each other. We in APCO, we have been the pioneer in promoting Filipino and Chinese understanding even before the establishment of diplomatic ties in 1975. And more than ever, we will be doing our role to promote even stronger Filipino and Chinese ties by doing our role in promoting cultural and educational missions. And such forum will be promoting LGU to LGU tie-ups. And we will also be promoting business and trade missions to each other's countries. So thank you again to our speakers this afternoon, Dr. Romel Banlawi and Herman Laurel. And to the rest of our audience, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We hope to see you again in our forum in July. Thank you and have a good day, everyone. Today's forum is now over. Thank you.